"You are an insect," shouted a millionaire to humiliate a poor woman she had invited to her party. Many years later, the millionaire could not believe it when she saw the woman again. The rhythmic sound of sewing machines filled the factory warehouse as Helena precisely adjusted the fabric under the needle. Her calloused fingers moved with agility over the fine material, transforming scraps into delicate pieces that would later be sold in high-end stores. Around her, dozens of other seamstresses kept their heads down, focused on their own machines, all aware of the constant presence of supervisors walking between the rows, timing each movement. "If I continue at this pace, I won't be able to deliver today's quota," thought Helena as she wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. The heat inside the warehouse was suffocating that afternoon, intensified by the steam rising from the irons and the air conditioning that had been broken for weeks. Helena observed the two young apprentices working close to her, both still teenagers, hired through the first employment program. The girls seemed exhausted, but maintained the accelerated work rhythm, fearful of losing the opportunity that so many other girls from the periphery aspired to. "These girls remind me so much of how I started 15 years ago," reflected Helena, feeling a pang of sadness upon realizing that nothing had changed since then. The production supervisor passed by her workstation, casting a disapproving look at the pile of pieces next to her machine. Helena knew she was behind. The back pain and accumulated fatigue from the last months of unpaid overtime were beginning to take their toll. "Helena, you're very slow today. You know we have a target to meet, don't you? The company cannot afford to keep unproductive employees," he said, in a tone that mixed authoritarianism and disdain, making sure to raise his voice so that all the other seamstresses would hear. The smell of burning started so subtly that initially Helena thought it was just another iron left on. It was common for this to happen, especially on days of higher production, when everyone was working at the limit of their strength. But gradually the odor intensified, becoming more acrid, more present. One of the apprentices raised her head, wrinkling her nose. "Miss Helena, are you smelling that strange odor?" she asked in a low voice, not wanting to draw the attention of the supervisor who had just walked away. That's when the first scream echoed from the other side of the warehouse. Helena raised her eyes from her machine in time to see a tongue of flame rise up the wall near the fabric storage area. The panic was instantaneous. Chairs were pushed, machines knocked over, and the orderly sound of production transformed into a cacophony of screams and rushing. "Everyone stay calm, head for the emergency exit," shouted the supervisor, but his voice was lost in the chaos that had set in. Helena rose from her chair, her heart beating rapidly in her chest. The flames were spreading with frightening speed, fueled by the rolls of fabric and stored chemicals. The heat was already intense, and the smoke was beginning to make the air unbreathable. Her colleagues were running toward the exits, some stumbling over exposed electrical wires, others trying to save their bags and personal belongings. "My God, this can't be happening," murmured Helena, as she watched the fire rapidly consume the entire environment that for so many years had been her workplace. Amid the chaos and thickening smoke, Helena heard a sound that made her blood freeze, crying and screams coming from the storage area. Through the curtain of smoke, she could distinguish the two young apprentices who were trapped between shelves of burning fabrics. The paralyzing fear on the girls' faces brought back memories of her own youth, when she too was just a frightened girl trying to survive in a hostile world. "Please, someone help us," they screamed, their voices almost lost in the crackling of the flames. The heat was increasingly intense and the smoke made breathing difficult. Helena knew she needed to get out of there. The building's structure was beginning to creak threateningly, and pieces of the ceiling were already falling around her. But something inside her prevented her from abandoning those girls. "I can't leave them here," she thought, as she tied a damp piece of fabric around her face and advanced toward the storage area, crouching to avoid the denser smoke that was accumulating above. The flames danced around her, consuming years of work and dreams reduced to ashes. Helena could feel the heat burning her skin as she approached the girls. One of them had her ankle trapped between fallen boxes, while the other, paralyzed by fear, clung to a shelf. "I'm going to get you out of here," promised Helena, her voice hoarse from the smoke as she began to remove the debris that trapped the first young woman. Time seemed to be running against them. The fire was getting closer and closer, and the air was becoming unbreathable even with the improvised protection. Helena managed to free the first girl and pushed her toward the nearest exit. "Run! Don't stop for anything," she shouted, then turning to the second apprentice who remained motionless in a state of shock. Sweat ran down her face, mixing with the soot, and her lungs burned with each breath. An explosion shook the building, probably some chemical reached by the fire. Part of the ceiling collapsed near them, partially blocking the path they had used to get there. Helena grabbed the second girl by the shoulders, forcing her to look into her eyes. "We need to leave now. You can do it. I know you can," she shouted, shaking her slightly until she saw a flash of understanding cross her frightened gaze. The smoke was getting thicker and the flames closer. Helena could feel her skin burning, but she couldn't stop now. Embracing the young apprentice, she began to guide her through the labyrinth of burning shelves. The shortest path was blocked by debris, forcing them to take a longer route, passing dangerously close to the main focus of the fire. "Just a little more," Helena murmured, both to the girl and to herself. Each step was a battle against pain and fear. The air was so hot that breathing was like swallowing embers. Helena could feel her strength draining, but the sight of the emergency exit, though partially obstructed, kept her moving. Almost there, she thought, pushing the young girl in front of her, protecting her with her own body from the flames licking at her back. The sound of fire truck sirens could already be heard in the distance, but Helena knew they couldn't wait for rescue. With one last effort, she pushed the girl through an opening in the partially collapsed wall. "Go, run away from the building," she ordered, her voice almost unrecognizable from the inhaled smoke. The young girl hesitated for a moment but finally obeyed, stumbling toward safety. The flames now surrounded Helena on all sides. Her vision was beginning to darken at the edges, and her legs trembled with the effort of keeping her standing. The exit was there, just a few meters away, but each step seemed to consume all her energy. "I need to make it," she muttered, fighting against the dizziness that threatened to overcome her. The world around her was spinning, and the heat was unbearable. The noise of the alarms blended with the crackling of flames as Helena staggered toward the exit. Her vision was blurred, and each breath was torture. Her lungs burned as if they were on fire, and she could feel blisters forming on her skin exposed to the intense heat. Just a few more steps, she thought, forcing her trembling legs to keep moving, even when her entire body begged to give up. Outside, a crowd was forming. Workers covered in soot, onlookers, and emergency teams that were beginning to arrive. The two young girls whom Helena had saved were being treated by paramedics, their faces stained with tears and smoke as they frantically pointed to the burning building. "She's still in there. Please, someone needs to help her," they shouted, their voices laden with desperation. Helena could see daylight through the thick smoke, a beam of hope that seemed increasingly distant. The air was so hot that breathing was like swallowing live embers. Her eyes burned, and she could barely keep them open. The world around her was beginning to lose form, transforming into a blur of colors and shadows. "I can't give up now," she murmured, dragging herself toward the light. The flames danced around her, consuming everything in their path. Helena could hear the crackling of wood and the sound of more parts of the ceiling collapsing behind her. The heat was unbearable, and she could feel her consciousness slipping away like water between fingers. Her legs finally gave way, and she fell to her knees, just a few meters from the exit. "Please, just a little more," she whispered, her voice no more than a breath. The firefighters were advancing toward her, their silhouettes distorted by smoke and heat. Helena tried to stand up again, but her body no longer responded to her commands. The pain from the burns was overwhelming, and every movement seemed impossible. The world was beginning to darken at the edges, and she could feel her consciousness fading. My girls, they made it. "They're safe," was her last coherent thought. The roar of the flames seemed increasingly distant, as if coming from another world. Helena felt her body fall forward, unable to resist any longer. Through her darkened vision, she saw figures running toward her, voices shouting orders that she could no longer understand. The heat, the pain, everything began to dissipate into a dark mist. "I'm sorry," she thought as darkness finally enveloped her. Outside, the crowd watched in horror as firefighters rushed to rescue Helena. The fire continued to consume the building, sending a column of black smoke into the sky. The two young apprentices cried in each other's arms, their eyes fixed on the building entrance. Please save her, they begged, their voices getting lost in the chaos of the scene. The sirens continued to wail, and more emergency teams arrived at the scene. The supervisor, who had been one of the first to escape, observed the scene with an expression of guilt and fear. He knew he would have to explain the factory conditions, the blocked emergency exits, the defective fire system. But at that moment, all that mattered was Helena's unconscious body being carried out of the burning building. Paramedics rushed to attend to Helena as soon as she was brought outside. Her body was covered in burns and she wasn't responding to any stimulus. "We need to take her to the hospital immediately," shouted one of the rescuers as they hastily prepared the emergency transport. The sun was beginning to set on the horizon, casting an orange glow over the chaotic scene as Helena's life hung by a thread. The next moment was pure panic. Paramedics struggled to stabilize Helena inside the ambulance while sirens cut through the afternoon air. No one knew if she would survive the journey to the hospital. The factory building, now completely engulfed in flames, was slowly collapsing, marking the end of an era and the beginning of a journey that would forever change the lives of everyone involved. "Hang in there, Helena," whispered one of the young apprentices, watching the ambulance depart at high speed. The constant beeping of cardiac monitors echoed through the corridors of the public hospital as doctors and nurses ran back and forth, trying to cope with the number of patients arriving. In the intensive care room, Helena remained motionless, connected to various machines that maintained her vital functions. Her face and body, covered with bandages, hid the real extent of the damage caused by the fire. "Another day without response," murmured the morning shift nurse, noting the vital signs on her chart. Doctors took turns in constant shifts, monitoring Helena's delicate condition. The burns were severe, covering a large part of her body, and smoke inhalation had caused significant damage to her lungs. An entire team was dedicated to keeping her stable, even with the hospital's limited resources. "We need more specific medications for burns, but the hospital has no funds," the professionals discussed during morning rounds. The two young women whom Helena had saved tried to visit her every day but were often prevented by the strict rules of the treatment unit. They waited in the hallway, their faces marked by concern and gratitude. "If it weren't for her, we wouldn't be here today," they repeated to anyone who would listen, as they observed through the glass the motionless figure of their savior. The head of the medical team examined the latest tests with growing concern. The hospital's resources were scarce, and the treatment needed for such severe cases as Helena's was far beyond what they could offer. "Without specialized treatment, her chances are minimal," he confided to his team, as they reviewed the options available within the limitations of the public system. News of the fire had spread quickly, and journalists tried daily to get information about the health status of the seamstress who had risked herself to save 2 lives. The hospital administration struggled to maintain the patient's privacy while dealing with media pressure and lack of resources. "We can't turn this into a media circus. She needs peace to recover," insisted the hospital director. Days turned into weeks, and Helena remained in her deep sleep. Doctors constantly monitored her vital signs, looking for any sign of improvement. The machines breathed for her, pumping oxygen into her damaged lungs, while powerful antibiotics fought the infections that threatened to settle in her burns. "Each day that passes without response diminishes her chances," whispered one of the residents. Helena's room had become a reference point in the treatment ward. Nurses and doctors stopped by frequently, checking her vital signs and adjusting her medication. Some talked to her, following the belief that patients in a coma could hear. "You need to fight, Helena. Many people are rooting for you," they said, hoping that somehow their words would reach her dormant consciousness. The hospital's financial situation was becoming increasingly critical. The costs of Helena's treatment increased daily, and available resources were increasingly scarce. The medical team was stretching itself thin to maintain the quality of care, even with the limitations. "We can't simply give up on her, but we also can't continue like this for much longer," the administrators debated in tense meetings. Helena's condition remained delicate, oscillating between moments of stability and crises that mobilized the entire team. Each small change was monitored closely, each new test was anxiously awaited. The lack of adequate resources made each decision an exercise in creativity and commitment. "We're doing the best we can with what we have, but she needs much more," lamented the physician in charge. The sound of the machines continued their constant rhythm, marking the passage of time in the silent room. Behind the bandages, Helena's body fought its own battle, while the medical team faced the harsh reality of trying to save a life with inadequate resources. "Time is passing, and our options are running out," thought the team leader, observing the monitors with growing concern. The medical team gathered in the hospital's small conference room, their tense faces reflecting the gravity of the situation. X-rays and tests were spread across the table, telling the silent story of the damage caused by the fire to Helena's body. The head of the plastic surgery team pointed to the images, his deep voice echoing in the crowded room. "The burns are third degree in 40% of the body. Without specialized surgical intervention, the scars will be severe and permanent." The doctors heatedly discussed treatment options, aware of the limitations they faced. The estimated cost of the necessary surgeries was astronomical by public hospital standards, and time was running against them. "Each day that passes without the proper procedure diminishes the chances of a satisfactory recovery," explained the specialist, while his colleagues examined the charts with worried expressions. In the hospital corridor, the two young apprentices anxiously awaited news. They had become constant presences, bringing flowers and cards, determined not to abandon the woman who had risked her own life to save them. One of them held a rosary between trembling fingers, murmuring prayers. "She can't stay like this, not after everything she did for us. There has to be a way to help her." The hospital director entered the conference room, bringing bad news. The budget was at its limit, and there was no provision for additional resources for special cases. Frustration was palpable among the professionals, who knew exactly what Helena needed but had no means to provide it. "How can we choose between saving a life and keeping the hospital running?" questioned one of the doctors, her voice choked with emotion. News about Helena's condition began to circulate in the local media, drawing attention to the precarious conditions of the hospital and the lack of resources for complex cases. Journalists clustered at the entrance, seeking updates about the factory heroine, as she had been nicknamed. "The public needs to know the truth about our healthcare system," argued a reporter, while trying to get information from the staff. In the trauma unit, the nursing team performed the dressing change, a painful procedure even with the patient sedated. The bandages revealed the extent of the burns, deep marks that told the story of her act of courage. "Without the reconstructive surgeries, she will have permanent limitations of movement," explained the head nurse to the residents who were following the procedure. The plastic surgery specialist remained by Helena's bedside, studying every detail of her injuries. He had treated countless burn cases throughout his career, but the complexity of this case, combined with the lack of resources, left him particularly frustrated. "With the proper equipment and team, we could work miracles. Without it, our hands are tied," he confided to a colleague. The days dragged on and Helena's condition remained critical. Infections were a constant threat, and the team struggled to keep her vital functions stable while desperately seeking a solution to the financial impasse. "We can't wait any longer. Each moment that passes diminishes the chances of a complete recovery," warned the head of the medical team during daily meetings. Helena's case had become a symbol of the deficiencies in the healthcare system. Highly qualified professionals, willing to do the impossible for their patients, but limited by lack of resources and infrastructure. The story was beginning to gain national repercussion, attracting the attention of specialists and authorities. "As a society, we need to decide how much a life is worth," questioned an editorial published in the local newspaper. Tension in the hospital increased each day. The doctors knew they were in a race against time. The longer it took to start specialized procedures, the greater the sequelae would be. Helena's once delicate face, now marked by burns, would be permanently altered without the necessary surgeries. "It's not just a question of aesthetics, it's about quality of life and human dignity," argued the plastic surgeon in yet another tense meeting with the hospital administration. The beginning of the evening brought a relative calm to the hospital corridors when a young nurse began her routine patient check. While reviewing Helena's latest tests, something caught her attention, a small discrepancy in hormone values that hadn't been noticed previously. Frowning, she began to review the entire history of tests. "There's something different here," she murmured to herself while comparing the results. With growing urgency, the nurse called the on-duty physician for a consultation. The numbers didn't lie. There was a consistent pattern that had gone unnoticed during the weeks of hospitalization, masked by the severity of the other injuries. "Doctor, I think we need to do a specific test," she suggested, pointing to the changes in the results of the latest blood tests. The pregnancy test was performed immediately, and the positive result fell like a bomb among the medical team. Helena wasn't just fighting for her own life. There was a second life at stake, one that nobody knew existed until that moment. "This completely changes the picture," declared the physician in charge, aware that all treatment protocols would need to be reviewed. The news spread quickly among the night shift professionals. The implications were enormous. Each medication being administered would need to be reassessed, each future procedure reconsidered. How did we not notice this before? The doctors questioned themselves, frantically reviewing the medical records in search of signs they might have missed. An emergency meeting was called, bringing together specialists from different areas. The case was already complex before. Now, with the pregnancy, it became even more delicate. The doctors heatedly discussed how to proceed. Each decision made would affect not only Helena, but also her developing baby. "We need to balance the treatment of burns with the safety of the pregnancy," argued the obstetrician called in urgently. The situation was becoming more critical with each minute. The medications being used to treat the burns and prevent infections needed to be immediately replaced with safer alternatives for pregnancy. "Some of these medicines can be harmful to the fetus," warned the clinical pharmacist, presenting a concerning list of medications that would need to be discontinued. In the quiet room, the monitors continued their constant beeping, now marking not only Helena's heartbeats, but also those of the small being growing in her womb. The nurse who had made the discovery remained beside the bed, gently adjusting the sensors. "You're protecting your baby even in a coma," she whispered, moved by the strength of that woman who, even unconscious, continued fighting. The medical team now faced an even greater dilemma. The necessary plastic surgeries would have to wait. The risk to the fetus would be too high. However, postponing the procedures meant increasing the chances of permanent scars and physical limitations for Helena. How to choose between the mother's recovery and the baby's safety, pondered the team leader, conscious of the weight of each decision. Dawn found the hospital in a state of controlled agitation. The news of the pregnancy had not yet reached the media, but it was only a matter of time. The hospital administrators already anticipated increased public pressure. Now it wasn't just the factory heroine who needed to be saved, but also her unborn child. "This will change everything," commented the hospital director, foreseeing the complications that were to come. The discovery of Helena's pregnancy added a new layer of complexity to an already extremely delicate case. The life growing inside her, bravely resisting alongside its mother, transformed each medical decision into an exercise of precarious balance. While the sun rose over the hospital, a question lingered in the air. How to save two lives with resources that were already insufficient for one? "Now more than ever, we need a miracle," whispered the nurse, watching the first rays of sunlight cross through the window of the intensive care unit room. The sound of high heels echoed through the hospital corridors, drawing the attention of staff and patients. Valentina Loureiro advanced with firm steps, her impeccable suit and shining jewelry drastically contrasting with the simple environment of the public hospital. Her personal assistant ran right behind, trying to keep up with her boss's accelerated pace while holding a folder full of documents. "I can't believe I had to come personally to this place," Valentina muttered, her nose slightly wrinkling as she smelled the characteristic hospital scent. The reporters camping at the hospital entrance immediately surrounded Valentina, microphones and cameras pointed in her direction. She maintained a studied smile on her face, while her assistant tried to push away the more insistent journalists. "The company is deeply distressed by what happened and is doing everything within its power to help our dedicated employee," she declared, her melodious voice masking the irritation evident in her eyes. The hospital director nervously waited at the reception, aware of the importance of that visit for the institution. Valentina greeted him with a quick and unenthusiastic handshake, barely disguising her discomfort for being there. "I hope this situation is resolved quickly. "The press is turning this into an unnecessary circus," she commented as she followed the director through the corridors. The hospital staff observed the entourage with a mixture of curiosity and distrust. Valentina Loureiro's reputation preceded her. Stories about her questionable business practices and her treatment of employees were well known. "It's the first time she deigns to appear, after almost a month since the accident," the nurses whispered among themselves as the businesswoman passed by. In the treatment wing, Valentina briefly stopped to retouch her lipstick, using the window's reflection. Her assistant took advantage of the moment to update the numbers of negative repercussions on social media. "The company's shares have fallen 5% since the accident, ma'am. Media pressure is increasing," she informed in a low voice, receiving in return an icy look from her boss. Before entering Helena's room, Valentina was approached by the two young apprentices whom her employee had saved. The girls, still with slight marks from the fire, tried to express their gratitude and concern for Helena. Valentina interrupted them with an impatient gesture. "You should be working, not wandering through hospital corridors. The company doesn't pay your salaries for this." The intensive care room was silent, except for the constant beeping of monitors. Valentina observed Helena's motionless figure with an indecipherable expression. Bandages covered a large part of her body, and the tubes and devices connected to her created an impactful vision. "Such drama for a simple seamstress," thought Valentina, while her assistant discreetly photographed the scene for the public relations department. The medical team took advantage of Valentina's presence to present Helena's real situation. They explained the need for specialized treatments, reconstructive surgeries, and the long recovery that would be necessary. Valentina listened with apparent attention, but her mind was already calculating the costs and, mainly, the risks for her company. "We need to resolve this as soon as possible," she declared, her cold voice echoing through the room. The head of the medical team tried to emphasize the gravity of the situation, explaining that Helena had risked herself to save 2 lives. Valentina interrupted him with an impatient gesture. "She only did what any person would do. We don't need to transform this into a heroism story." The visit lasted less than 15 minutes. As she left, Valentina was already on the phone with her legal department, her voice assuming a harder tone. "Prepare all the necessary documents. We can't let this snowball, and call the press. We'll make an official pronouncement right here in front of the hospital." The hospital's meeting room was packed. On one side of the table, Valentina Loureiro and her legal team. On the other, the hospital administration and the doctors responsible for Helena's case. The air conditioning barely worked, making Valentina constantly fan herself with a document folder. "Let's be direct," she began, her voice cutting through the tense air in the room. "I'm here to resolve this situation in the most efficient way possible." The company's lead attorney opened his briefcase, spreading documents across the table. Numbers, reports, and complex legal terms filled the pages, all carefully prepared for that moment. "The company is willing to cover all the employees' medical expenses," he explained, "under some conditions that we consider perfectly reasonable." The proposal was clear. A generous agreement to cover Helena's medical treatment, including necessary surgeries, in exchange for her renouncing any future labor lawsuits. "We are offering much more than any judge would grant," argued Valentina, her smile not reaching her eyes. "After all, the accident was a fatality for which the company cannot be held responsible." The doctors present exchanged glances, incredulous at the coldness of the situation. The head of the medical team tried to intervene, explaining the extent of the damage suffered by Helena and the long recovery ahead of her. Valentina interrupted him with an impatient gesture. "Doctor, we're talking business here. Sentimentality won't pay the hospital bills." The tension in the room increased with each passing minute. Valentina's legal team presented clause after clause of the agreement, each more restrictive than the last. "The employee must maintain absolute confidentiality about the accident and its circumstances," read the lawyer, while the hospital administrators made frantic notes. The hospital director, pressured by the lack of resources, seemed tempted by the offer. The surgeries that Helena needed were expensive, and the hospital could barely maintain basic treatments. "We need to think about the patient's well-being," he argued, receiving in return a satisfied smile from Valentina. The hospital social worker, who until then had remained silent, finally spoke up. How can we accept such an agreement without the consent of the main interested party? She questioned, her voice trembling with indignation. Valentina adjusted her expensive jewelry with a studied gesture. Sometimes we need to make difficult decisions for those who cannot do so. Time seemed to drag on while more details of the agreement were discussed. Valentina constantly consulted her luxury watch, clearly anxious to end that meeting and return to her world of privilege. The faster we resolve this, the better for everyone involved, she insisted, her impatience becoming increasingly evident. The final proposal was placed on the table, a considerable amount for Helena's treatment, but with so many restrictions and confidentiality clauses that they would practically silence her forever. "Take it or leave it," declared Valentina, rising from her chair, "and the offer has an expiration date." The silence of the room contrasted drastically with the agitation taking over the hospital. Valentina Loureiro, followed by her legal team and the hospital administration, entered the sterile environment. The only sounds were the constant beeping of monitors and the mechanical breathing of the machines keeping Helena alive. "Look," said Valentina, her voice laden with false concern. "She can't even tell us what she thinks about our generous offer." The medical team observed the scene with apprehension. Helena remained motionless in her bed, oblivious to the decisions being made about her future. The bandages covering her burns hid not only her physical wounds, but also the vulnerability of her situation. "The patient still shows no signs of consciousness," informed the responsible physician, his voice betraying frustration with the situation. Valentina's assistant recorded everything on her phone, while the lawyers discussed in low voices the legal implications of making decisions for a patient in a coma. The hospital director, visibly uncomfortable, alternated his gaze between Helena and the agreement papers in his hands. "We cannot simply ignore her rights," he muttered, more to himself than to others. Valentina circulated around the room like a predator studying its prey, her high heels marking an unsettling rhythm on the hospital floor. She observed the medical equipment with barely disguised disdain, as if each device represented an unnecessary cost. "How much longer do you think she'll stay like this?" she asked, her voice barely masking her impatience. The two young apprentices who observed everything through the room's window could barely contain their tears. They knew they owed their lives to the woman who now lay unconscious, while others decided her fate. "She deserves much more than this," whispered one of them, squeezing her companion's hand for comfort. The company's lead attorney seized the moment to press even harder. If there is no decision today, the company cannot guarantee that the offer will remain valid. Her statement hung in the air like a veiled threat, making the already tense atmosphere even heavier. The doctors exchanged worried glances, aware of what that decision would mean for Helena's treatment. The head nurse, who had been caring for Helena since her arrival, couldn't contain herself. What if she wakes up and doesn't agree with this? How will we explain that we made such a decision for her? Valentina shot an icy glare in her direction. If she wakes up, she should be grateful for all the support we're offering. Time seemed frozen in that hospital room. On one side, an unconscious woman fighting for her life. On the other, a businesswoman determined to protect her interests at any cost. The agreement document seemed to weigh a ton in the hospital director's hands, who had not yet given his final answer. The social worker, who remained in a corner of the room, finally spoke. "We need more time. We cannot make a decision of this magnitude without trying to locate a family member." Valentina rolled her eyes, her patience clearly running out. Time is money, and we've lost too much of both here today. The sun was beginning to set, casting unsettling shadows across the room through the blinds. Each strip of light created geometric patterns on the hospital's white floor, like invisible lines, demarcating territories of power and vulnerability. Valentina adjusted her designer bag on her shoulder, a gesture so automatic she barely needed to think. Years of social training had transformed every movement into a calculated performance. Her eyes scanned the silent room one last time, looking for any detail that might have escaped her strategy. Helena remained motionless, connected to dozens of tubes and monitors, her existence reduced to those machines that kept her precariously alive. Valentina felt a peculiar discomfort. It wasn't compassion, definitely not. It was something closer to irritation at seeing a problem that refused to be quickly resolved. The heels of her shoes echoed, a metallic sound marking each step of her departure. Her assistant followed discreetly, carrying a folder with the preliminary documents of the agreement. "Prepare the final terms," Valentina murmured, without even looking back. "I want everything ready by dawn." The hospital corridor seemed longer that afternoon. Faded paintings of generic landscapes hung on the walls, silent witnesses to countless human dramas. Valentina ignored them, her mind already calculating the next moves. Helena could not be a problem, could not be a risk to the company's image. Her last look at Helena was a mixture of disdain and calculated irritation. The muscles around her eyes contracted slightly, the maximum emotional expression she allowed to show. "You have until tomorrow to decide. After that, the company takes no further responsibility." The words came out like a whip, cutting through the air of the hospital room. As she headed for the door, Valentina felt a slight discomfort. It wasn't remorse, she didn't know such a feeling. It was more like a restlessness, an uncomfortable presentiment that gnawed at her usual certainty. Helena represented something more than just a problematic employee. There was in her a resistance that Valentina couldn't completely categorize. The assistant opened the car door, a gleaming black Mercedes parked in the reserved area of the hospital. Valentina entered, her leather-gloved hands adjusting her skirt. "We need to neutralize any possibility of legal issues," she said, breaking the silence. The driver merely confirmed with a discreet nod. Outside, the city continued its indifferent rhythm. Workers leaving their jobs, congested traffic, life following its constant flow. For Valentina, that moment was just another negotiation, another problem to be solved with the same efficiency with which she resolved all obstacles in her path. Her cell phone vibrated, another report, another decision to be made. Valentina examined it quickly, her eyes scanning the lines like an eagle identifying its prey. Nothing could interfere with her plans. No one could represent a real threat to her empire. With these words, she headed to the hospital door, leaving behind a trail of tension and uncertainty, while Helena continued in her deep sleep, oblivious to the drama unfolding around her. But something in the air seemed to whisper that not everything would be as simple as Valentina imagined. The morning had barely begun when Valentina Loureiro entered her luxurious office on the top floor of one of the most expensive buildings in the city. Her mood was particularly dark as she reviewed the latest reports on Helena's case. "That woman is becoming a much bigger problem than she should be," she murmured, while her assistant served her coffee in a fine porcelain cup. On her polished mahogany desk, carefully forged documents awaited her final approval. The legal team had worked all night, creating a complex web of papers that would give Valentina total power over Helena's medical decisions. "It's amazing how a few signatures can change everything," she commented, a cold smile forming on her perfectly painted lips. The hospital social worker had managed to discover that Helena had no close family, information that Valentina planned to use to her advantage. With a precise movement, she signed the documents that declared her temporarily responsible for all medical decisions related to Helena. "Sometimes we need to take control of the situation with our own hands," she declared, satisfied with her scheme. The head of the company's legal department presented the meticulously elaborated plan. Fake documents indicated a supposed previous relationship between Valentina and Helena, creating an artificial bond that would justify the temporary guardianship. "Nobody will question the word of a respected businesswoman," he assured, while organizing the papers in an elegant folder. Valentina observed the city through the enormous windows of her office, feeling in total control of the situation. Her mind was already calculating how she would transform this crisis into a propaganda opportunity for her company. "We'll make it look like I'm doing this out of pure kindness," she instructed her public relations team, who were already preparing an emotional press release. The operation to present the documents to the hospital was planned with military precision. Valentina carefully chose her outfit, a discreet but elegant suit that conveyed authority and false compassion. "Her appearance is everything in this game," she commented, adjusting her expensive jewelry before leaving. At the hospital, her entrance was triumphant. Surrounded by her legal team and carrying the documents that would give her control over Helena's fate, Valentina advanced through the corridors with the confidence of someone who knows they've won. The hospital staff watched with apprehension as she headed to the administration. "I've come to definitively resolve the situation of our dear employee," she announced, her melodious voice masking her true intentions. The hospital director, pressured by the lack of resources and the growing media attention, barely had time to question the legitimacy of the documents. Valentina presented everything with such conviction and authority that his doubts were quickly silenced. "From now on, all decisions about Helena's treatment go through me," she declared, her voice leaving no room for arguments. The two young apprentices who still visited Helena daily observed the scene with suspicion. They could feel that something was wrong, but had no power to question the situation. She never mentioned knowing Ms. "Valentina," whispered one of them to the head nurse, who just shook her head in silence. Valentina's victory was sealed. With the documents signed and stamped, she now had total control over Helena's fate. Her last look at the room before leaving revealed her true nature, a cold gleam of triumph in her eyes as she murmured to herself, "Now we'll do things my way." With her newly acquired authority, Valentina called a meeting with the hospital's medical team. Seated at the head of the conference table, she carelessly leafed through the detailed medical reports on Helena's condition. "We don't need such sophisticated treatments," she declared, dismissing the carefully elaborated recommendations of the team. "Let's opt for more economical alternatives." The head of the plastic surgery team tried to argue, explaining the necessity of specific procedures to avoid permanent sequelae. Valentina interrupted him with an impatient gesture. "Doctor, she is a simple seamstress. She doesn't need to look like a model." Her cold laugh echoed through the room, making the doctors present exchange uncomfortable glances. With cruel efficiency, Valentina began to cross procedures off the list of recommended treatments. Essential reconstructive surgeries were replaced with basic options, cutting-edge medications with cheaper generic alternatives. "She should be thankful to be alive," commented Valentina, while ignoring the silent protests of the healthcare professionals. The head nurse, who had been caring for Helena since her hospitalization, couldn't contain her indignation. "These decisions may cause permanent damage." Valentina raised her eyes from the documents, her gaze sharp as a blade. "Your job is to follow orders, not question them. Or would you prefer to look for another job?" The doctors were forced to watch helplessly as Valentina methodically dismantled the treatment plan. Each budget cut represented one more chance of recovery being denied to Helena. "The company's insurance won't cover extravagances," declared Valentina, her voice distilling venom disguised as financial concern. The news of the changes in treatment spread quickly through the hospital. The two young apprentices who owed their lives to Helena wept silently in the hallway. How can she do this to someone who saved 2 lives? They wondered, unable to comprehend such cruelty. Valentina organized a press conference in the hospital itself, transforming her petty economizing into a display of false compassion. "We are doing everything possible within reality," she declared for the cameras, her rehearsed smile hiding the satisfaction of having total control of the situation. The new treatment plan was implemented immediately. More sophisticated equipment was replaced with basic alternatives, special dressings with simpler versions. Valentina personally supervised each change, ensuring that her orders were followed to the letter. "We're not running a luxury spa here." The medical team tried one last appeal, presenting studies that proved the necessity of more advanced treatments. Valentina didn't even bother to read the documents. "You doctors always exaggerate. She'll survive all the same." The sun was setting on the horizon when Valentina finally left the hospital, satisfied with her decisions for the day. Before leaving, she briefly stopped at Helena's room, observing the unconscious patient with a mixture of disdain and triumph. "You should have thought better before playing the hero." Hours later, consciousness slowly returned to Helena, like a fog gradually dissipating. The first sounds she distinguished were the rhythmic beeps of monitors and distant voices that seemed to come from far away. Her eyelids felt heavy as lead, and each attempt to open them required a monumental effort. "She's responding," exclaimed a female voice, followed by agitated movement around her. The world around Helena was a confusion of blinding lights and indistinct shadows. She tried to speak, but her throat was dry and rough, and no sound came out. A nurse approached with a cup of water and a straw, helping her take small sips. "Slowly, Helena. You've been asleep for a long time," explained the professional, her gentle voice contrasting with the harshness of the hospital environment. When Helena finally managed to focus her vision, The first thing she noticed was the distorted reflection of her face in a metal tray near the bed. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. She tried to smile, but only one side of her lips responded to the command. The other side remained motionless, as if it no longer belonged to her body. Why can't I? Her voice came out hoarse and broken. The medical team tried to calm her, explaining about the accident, the time in a coma, the limitations of the treatment. But Helena barely heard. Her hands trembled as they touched her face, feeling the scars and the abnormal stiffness of her skin. One of the nurses tried to remove the metal tray, but Helena held it firmly, unable to look away from her unrecognizable reflection. The tears began to fall, but even they seemed wrong now. They fell only down one side of her face, while the other remained impassive like a wax mask. Is this permanent?" asked Helena, her voice choked with fear and pain. The silence of the medical team was more eloquent than any answer. One of the young apprentices whom Helena had saved entered the room, her eyes filling with tears upon seeing her savior awake. She began to talk about how Helena was a hero, how she had saved their lives, but stopped when she realized that each word only amplified Helena's awareness of her sacrifice. "I'm sorry," whispered the girl, backing toward the door. The head of the medical team tried to explain about the limitations imposed on the treatment, about how decisions had been made while she was unconscious. Helena listened to everything with a blank expression on half of her face, while the other half contorted in a mixture of pain and disbelief. Who decided this?" she asked, her voice trembling. The head nurse hesitated before answering, but Helena deserved to know the truth. Valentina Loureiro, the factory owner. She obtained temporary guardianship over her medical decisions. The name fell like a bomb in the silent room. Helena closed her eyes, remembering the proud and cruel figure who used to walk around the factory, looking at the seamstresses as if they were less than nothing. The day advanced outside, but for Helena, time had stopped in that moment of discovery. Her reflection in the metal tray continued to stare back at her, a constant reminder of the price she had paid for her act of courage. One of the nurses tried to remove the tray once more, but Helena held it firmly. "Leave it," she said, her voice taking on a tone that no one had heard before. "I need to get used to what she did to me." The room plunged into a heavy silence, broken only by the constant beeping of the monitors. The mechanical rhythm of the machines seemed to mark the tempo of a new reality that Helena was being forced to accept. The air conditioner hummed softly, creating a curtain of white noise that only intensified the loneliness of the moment. Helena continued to observe her reflection in the metal tray, her eyes tracing each new line that now marked her face. Her mind, still clouded by medication, processed not just the extent of her physical scars, but also the depth of human cruelty that had allowed this to happen. The contrast between the two sides of her face was a silent testimony to the difference between the treatment she needed and what she received. Nurses occasionally passed by in the corridor, their shadows dancing across the glass window of the room, like silent spectators to her discovery. Inside the room, time seemed to have stopped. The afternoon sun cast elongated shadows through the blinds, creating a pattern of bars across her bed, a prison of light that mirrored her own imprisonment in a body now partially paralyzed. Her fingers trembled slightly as they touched the bandages and exposed skin, mapping the unknown territory that her face had become. Each touch revealed a new reality, a new limitation, a new reminder of the power that Valentina had exercised over her fate. The right side of her face responded normally to touch, sending familiar sensations to her brain. The left side, however, remained strangely distant, as if it belonged to someone else. On the small table beside the bed, a half-empty glass of water reflected the late afternoon light, creating a small rainbow on the wall, a cruel irony against the darkness of her thoughts. The papers documenting the medical decisions made by Valentina were stacked there, each page a testament to the calculated coldness with which her treatment was conducted. The two young apprentices had left flowers earlier, simple daisies in a plastic vase, their simplicity dramatically contrasting with the sterile hospital environment. The soft perfume of the flowers seemed out of place in that moment of brutal discovery, like a futile attempt to soften a reality that had nothing delicate about it. On her partially paralyzed face, a single tear began its solitary journey down the side that could still express emotions. It was as if all the pain, all the anger, all the disbelief at human cruelty had condensed into that single drop of salt water. The tear slowly slid down her cheek, carrying with it not just sadness, but the weight of a silent promise. That solitary tear carried within it a transformation. It wasn't just water and salt. It was the last tear of weakness she would allow herself to shed. Like an hourglass marking the passage between two distinct moments of her life, that drop of water marked the end of one Helena and the birth of another. The reflection in the metal tray now showed more than a face marked by tragedy. It showed the first traces of a metamorphosis that was just beginning. In the silence of the room, broken only by the rhythmic beeps marking her survival, a new Helena began to emerge from the ashes of her former life. Darkness took over the room as the sun set, but something in Helena's eyes shone with a new intensity. On her asymmetrical face, where pain and determination now shared space, a silent promise was taking shape, the promise that each scar, each limitation, each moment of pain would be transformed into fuel for a change much greater than Valentina could imagine. Days later, Valentina Loureiro's mansion gleamed under the nightlights as dozens of luxury cars arrived for the charity event. Waiters circulated with trays of fine drinks, and the soft music of an orchestra floated through the air. In the center of the main hall, a huge banner announced, "Night of Solidarity supporting our employees." Valentina, dazzling in her designer dress, supervised every detail with a calculated smile. Helena arrived at the party in a simple car sent by the company. Her scars, still in the healing process, were partially covered by improvised makeup, but nothing could hide the partial paralysis of her face. She wore a modest dress, chosen by Valentina's public relations team. "You are our guest of honor," they told her, as if this was an honor and not a planned humiliation. The guests, all from high society, observed Helena with a mixture of curiosity and poorly disguised pity. Their whispers followed her like a shadow as she crossed the hall. "That's the one from the factory," they whispered among themselves, bringing champagne glasses to their painted lips. What a tragedy, but how kind of Valentina to help her. Minutes passed and Valentina circulated among the guests like a queen in her court, occasionally stopping to take photos next to Helena. "See how we are a company that cares about its employees," she declared to the photographers, her arm lightly resting on Helena's tense shoulders. "Tonight is to show that we are all one big family." The two young apprentices whom Helena had saved were also brought to the event, dressed in impeccable company uniforms. They tried to approach Helena, but were constantly pushed away by the party organizers. "You are part of the scenery, darlings," Valentina's assistant coldly instructed. "Stay where you were placed." The highlight of the night was approaching, Valentina's speech. The waiters began to strategically position the guests, ensuring that the cameras captured the best angles. Helena was placed near the improvised stage, like an exhibition piece in a private museum of horrors. Valentina climbed onto the small stage, her dress sparkling under the spotlights. Her melodious voice filled the environment as she began her carefully rehearsed speech about corporate compassion and social responsibility. "Tonight," she announced, "we celebrate not only the recovery of an employee, but the spirit of unity that defines us as a company." Applause echoed through the hall as Valentina continued her monologue. Helena remained motionless in her designated place, feeling more and more like an object on display. The empty words about kindness and charity made her stomach turn, but she maintained her neutral expression, or at least the part of her face that could still express emotions. Cameras fired incessantly, capturing every moment of the grotesque spectacle that Valentina had orchestrated. The guests drank and applauded, completely oblivious to the true drama unfolding before them. "This is the true face of our company," declared Valentina, her voice laden with false emotion. "A face of compassion and care for those who need it most." In the center of all that elaborate farce, Helena felt suffocated. Each camera light, each look of pity, each false word from Valentina was like a new scar being marked on her soul. The night had only begun, and she could already feel that the worst was yet to come. The event was following its course when Valentina made a subtle gesture to her assistant, who immediately brought a folder of documents. The businesswoman's smile grew even wider as she prepared for her next act in that cruel staging. "Helena, dear, come here," she called, her voice sweet as poison. "I have a surprise for you." The guests formed a circle, creating an improvised arena in the middle of the hall. Helena walked slowly to the center, each step echoing in her ears like a harbinger of misfortune. Valentina held the documents like someone holding a loaded gun, her eyes shining with predatory satisfaction. One of the company's lawyers approached, carrying more papers. In view of the accident and its consequences, he began, measuring each word, the company has decided that the best for everyone is to terminate your employment contract. The words fell like stones in the silence that formed as the guests watched the spectacle with morbid interest. Helena felt her legs weaken, but remained standing. But how will I support myself? How will I pay for treatments? She asked, her voice trembling. Valentina intervened with a cruel smile. Well, you've already received more than you deserved. Our generosity has limits. The two young apprentices who observed the scene from afar tried to approach to support Helena, but were discreetly restrained by security guards. Stay where you are, Valentina's assistant ordered dryly. This does not concern you. With theatrical gestures, Valentina began to read aloud the terms of dismissal. Each word was carefully chosen to humiliate Helena even more. Considering your current condition, she emphasized, it's obvious that you are no longer able to perform your duties adequately. The documents were pushed toward Helena, along with an expensive pen that seemed to weigh a ton. Sign, ordered Valentina, her tone leaving no room for discussion. Unless, of course, you prefer to bear all the medical expenses that we have so generously covered until now. Helena looked at the papers, her hands trembling. Not only was she being fired, but she was also being forced to give up any labor rights. The agreement was clear. In exchange for not being charged for medical expenses already incurred, she should renounce everything: her job, her rights, her dignity. The silence in the hall was deafening as Helena stared at the documents. The guests watched the scene like spectators of a cruel theater, champagne glasses forgotten in their hands, absorbed in the drama unfolding. "We're waiting," said Valentina, her voice cutting through the air like a razor. With the documents signed under coercion, Helena remained motionless in the center of the hall, her hands still trembling. It was then that Valentina decided to deliver the final blow. Raising her champagne glass, she addressed the guests with a cruel smile on her perfectly painted lips. "Look, everyone, what a wonderful example of overcoming." Her voice, laden with sarcasm, echoed throughout the room. The circle of guests closed in even more, like vultures around injured prey. Valentina circled around Helena, her designer dress rustling in the tense silence. "You know," she continued, her voice rising to ensure everyone heard, "some people simply don't know their place. They think a single act of courage," she practically spat the word, "makes them special." Helena tried to move to escape that circle of cruel glances and smiles, but Valentina held her by the arm. "Where are you going, dear? The party has barely begun." The entire hall watched hypnotized as the businesswoman exposed her true nature. "Do you really think she did something extraordinary?" "No, my friends, she acted on pure instinct, like an insect that struggles when in danger." Valentina's words cut through the air like blades. "Look at her now. Half her face paralyzed, scars all over her body. And for what? To save two insignificant apprentices who could be easily replaced." The two young women, still restrained by security guards, cried silently upon hearing those cruel words. "You are an insect," declared Valentina, her voice rising in a crescendo of cruelty. "A small and insignificant insect that had the audacity to think it could equal us, that thought its foolish act of heroism would make it special." The champagne in her glass shimmered under the hall lights as she gestured dramatically. The guests, previously just silent spectators, began to laugh nervously, some out of genuine cruelty, others out of fear of contradicting Valentina. The sound of their laughter echoed through the hall like a macabre chorus, while Helena remained there, exposed and humiliated. "But don't worry," continued Valentina, her voice now a theatrical whisper. "We took care of you, didn't we? Gave you the treatment you deserved." She made a dramatic pause, savoring every moment of that psychological torture. "Now you can go back to your little world, to your insignificant existence. After all, that's what insects do. They survive in the cracks, in the shadows." Tears ran down only one side of Helena's face, the only side still able to express emotions. The other side remained frozen, as if even her scars refused to give Valentina the satisfaction of seeing her complete pain. With an elegant gesture, Valentina emptied her champagne glass and deliberately let it fall near Helena's feet. The fine crystal shattered on the marble floor, the sound echoing like a shot in the now silent hall. "Someone clean up this mess," she ordered, looking directly at Helena, "and take our little insect outside. The party is over for her." Helena was practically dragged out of the mansion by security guards, her faltering steps leaving a trail of wounded dignity across the expensive carpet. Her simple dress, chosen with such care for that night, now seemed to weigh tons on her shoulders. The scars on her face burned as if they were fresh, each one a cruel reminder of everything she had sacrificed only to be humiliated this way. Outside, the night breeze carried fragments of the party that continued as if nothing had happened. The sound of silver cutlery tinkling against fine porcelain, crystal glasses being raised in frivolous toasts, superficial conversations and rehearsed laughter, a grotesque symphony of privilege and indifference. The last thing Helena heard before the heavy oak doors closed was Valentina's crystalline laughter, sharp as broken glass, blending perfectly with the sound of the orchestra that began playing again. The two young apprentices she had saved tried to follow her, but were brutally restrained by the security guards. Their cries of protest were lost in the music that increased in volume, as if trying to muffle the echo of the cruelty that had just happened. Helena could hear their muffled sobs, another layer of pain in a night already saturated with humiliation. Standing at the entrance of the mansion, Helena observed her distorted reflection in the mirrored windows. Half of her face remained frozen, unable to express the storm of emotions consuming her inside. The other half clearly showed the result of the economic treatment that Valentina had chosen for her, a permanent scar of her cruelty. The luxurious gardens of the mansion, illuminated by hundreds of decorative lights, seemed to mock her situation. Rare flowers and perfectly trimmed topiaries created a fairy tale setting that cruelly contrasted with the nightmare she had just experienced. The sweet perfume of expensive roses mingled with the bitter taste of bile rising in her throat. That night, as she walked alone down the avenue of imported stones, something died inside Helena. Her innocence, her faith in human kindness, her belief in natural justice. Each step that took her away from that place was like a nail in the coffin of who she used to be. The sound of the party gradually diminished, but the echo of Valentina's words, "You are an insect," might continue to reverberate in her mind with crystal clarity. But in the shadows of that night of humiliation, something much stronger began to be born. It was like a phoenix rising from the ashes of her destroyed dignity, a burning desire for justice that went far beyond common revenge. Her hands unconsciously rested on her belly, where an innocent life was growing, oblivious to the drama unfolding. This little being would be her strength, her motivation, her constant reminder that even insects can transform into something more powerful. The lights of the mansion were left behind, but their glow now served as a reverse beacon, no longer a symbol of status and power, but a constant reminder of what she would need to overcome. The sound of the orchestra finally got lost in the night, but a new music began to play in Helena's heart, a melody of determination, transformation, rebirth. There, in the darkness of her darkest hour, Helena silently vowed that she would return. Not as the humiliated seamstress who was being expelled, but as something much more powerful. The tears that ran down only one side of her face were no longer of sadness or humiliation. They were the prelude to a metamorphosis that would transform not only her life, but that of everyone around her. The morning sun reflected on the mirrored windows of the modern corporate building. An elegant woman descended from her limousine, her impeccable suit and her lofty posture drawing the attention of passers-by. It was Helena, but not the same as years ago. Time and determination had transformed the former seamstress into a powerful textile entrepreneur. The scars on her face, still visible, now seemed to tell a story of overcoming rather than defeat. In her corporate penthouse, Helena observed the city through the windows of her office. On the conference table, detailed reports about Valentina Loureiro's company were spread out. Years of accumulated losses, decline in product quality, employee dissatisfaction. "The time has come," she murmured, running her fingers over the pages detailing her former tormentor's vulnerability. Her assistant entered the room carrying more documents. "The numbers from the latest market research have arrived, ma'am." Her company continues in free fall. Helena smiled, a gesture that still manifested on only half of her face, but now carried a different strength. "Great. Pride always comes before the fall," she replied, elegantly adjusting her posture in the chair. The empire that Helena had built in recent years was impressive. Her factories were a model of humanized management with exemplary working conditions and profit sharing for all employees. She had transformed her traumatic experience into fuel to create something completely opposite to what Valentina represented. "Every employee is treated with dignity here," she frequently explained in interviews. On her desk, an old photograph caught attention. The two young apprentices she had saved from the fire now occupying leadership positions in her company. They had been the first people Helena sought when she began building her empire. "Loyalty and gratitude are values money can't buy," she often said, remembering the night when Valentina had treated them as disposable. Helena's transformation wasn't limited to business. She had studied, traveled, learned everything she could about the textile market. Her scars, which Valentina had imagined would keep her in the shadows, became a symbol of her resilience. "Each mark on my face is a lesson in strength," she declared in her motivational speeches, inspiring others to overcome their own adversities. The years of preparation were finally bearing fruit. Helena had built her company strategically, always keeping an eye on the moment when she could confront Valentina on her own territory. "The market is like a great web," she explained to her team of directors. "Handsome spiders don't realize when they're about to fall into their own trap." News about problems in Valentina's company spread throughout the financial market. Poor management, labor lawsuits, low-quality products, everything Helena had experienced firsthand now came back to haunt her former boss. "It's amazing how the universe sometimes conspires in favor of justice," she commented, analyzing the latest market reports. The moment was perfect. Valentina's company was vulnerable, its stocks down, its reputation tarnished by successive scandals. Helena had waited patiently for years, building her empire silently, preparing for the exact moment to strike. "Some call it revenge," she reflected, watching the sun set through her office window. "I call it poetic justice." Night was already falling when Helena finally prepared to leave her office. Tomorrow would be a big day, the beginning of her boldest move. "Prepare the documents for tomorrow," she instructed her assistant. "It's time to show Valentina Loureiro that even the smallest insects can transform into predators." The movement in the financial market began subtly. Small batches of shares from Valentina's company being purchased by different brokerages, all linked to shell companies carefully created by Helena. "Keep the purchases discreet," she instructed her financial director. "We don't want to draw attention before the right moment." In her private office, Helena coordinated each move with the precision of a chess player. Charts and reports covered the walls, showing the progressive weakening of Valentina's empire. "She's so busy keeping up appearances that she doesn't notice the ground disappearing beneath her feet," Helena remarked, observing the latest stock quotes. The two former apprentices, now trusted executives, actively participated in the operation. One commanded the market intelligence team, while the other coordinated negotiations with different brokerages. "It's like a puzzle," Helena explained. "Each piece needs to fit perfectly without revealing the complete picture." The strategy was meticulous. Helena had studied every weakness in Valentina's company, every vulnerability in its corporate structure. Shares were purchased in small batches, through different companies at a calculated pace to avoid arousing suspicion. "Like a spider weaving its web," she murmured, satisfied with the progress. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Slowly but with relentless consistency, Helena increased her stake in Valentina's company. Each new acquisition was like a silent step toward her revenge. "Patience is the mother of perfection," she reminded her team, when some showed anxiety with the slowness of the process. In secret meetings at her corporate penthouse, Helena monitored progress reports. She already controlled 15% of the shares, then 20, 30. Each percentage was a silent victory, one step closer to total control. "Continue buying," she directed, but maintain the pattern of dispersed acquisitions. The financial market buzzed with rumors about a mysterious buyer accumulating shares of Valentina's company. Speculations emerged in specialized blogs and corridor conversations, but no one could identify the true buyer. Let them speculate, Helena smiled. The mystery only increases the value of the prize. The operation consumed enormous resources, but Helena had prepared for years for this moment. Every penny invested was part of her revenge plan. Each share purchased was a step closer to her personal justice. Money is just a tool, she explained. The true value is in what we do with it. The critical point was approaching. Helena already controlled nearly 40% of the shares, dangerously approaching the limit that would make it impossible to hide her identity. "We're almost there," she announced in a meeting with her closest team. It's time to prepare the final blow. The last purchase orders were given at nightfall. Helena remained in her office, watching the city lights, savoring the anticipation of what was to come. Tomorrow, she thought, lightly touching the scars on her face, Valentina will discover that she underestimated the power of an insect. The first signs that something was wrong reached Valentina's desk on a seemingly ordinary morning. Her financial director entered her office visibly disturbed, carrying a stack of urgent reports. "Mrs. Loureiro, we need to talk about the strange movement of our shares," he said, his voice betraying genuine concern. Valentina, who was busy choosing jewelry for a charity event, barely raised her eyes. "What movement? The market always fluctuates," she responded with disdain, more interested in the reflection of her diamond earrings in the mirror on her desk. The director insisted, spreading alarming graphs in front of her. "This isn't a normal fluctuation. Someone is systematically buying large blocks of company shares." Valentina's first reaction was irritation at the interruption of her vanity routine. But as the numbers were presented, her face began to lose color. "What do you mean 40% of the shares are no longer under our control? Who is buying? How did you let this happen?" Her voice rose with each question, panic beginning to set in. An emergency meeting was hastily convened. Nervous executives crowded the meeting room while Valentina demanded answers. "I want names." "I want to know who is behind this," she shouted, her normally controlled face now contorted with rage and fear. "How did nobody notice this before?" The reports were clear and frightening. A mysterious buyer had meticulously acquired a significant amount of shares through different companies and brokers. "It's an extremely sophisticated operation," explained the legal director. "Whoever is doing this has carefully planned every detail." Valentina began to feel control slipping through her perfectly manicured fingers. Her expensive jewelry and designer clothes couldn't mask the terror she now felt. "Call all our contacts in the market. I want to know who's buying these shares, even if we have to stay up all night." Employees ran back and forth trying to gather information, while Valentina remained in her office, sipping coffee that had already gone cold. For the first time in years, she felt real fear. "This can't be happening," she muttered to herself as she watched the empire she had built begin to crumble. As the night progressed, more troubling news arrived. Other shareholders, sensing the change in the wind, were beginning to sell their stakes. The mysterious buyer continued acquiring every available share, dangerously approaching majority control of the company. Valentina, now alone in her office, stared at her own image reflected in the darkened windows. The power she so cherished was flowing like water between her fingers. Who would dare? She wondered, her mind going through a list of possible enemies, a list that she now realized was frighteningly long. The last report of the night was like a mercy shot, arriving when the company corridors were practically deserted. The letterhead paper, delivered by a nervous messenger, trembled in the hands of the financial director as he ran to Valentina's office. The mysterious buyer had exceeded the 45% mark of shares, a number that made the blood freeze in the veins of any experienced business person. Valentina held the paper with trembling hands, her fingers covered with expensive rings, slightly crumpling the edges of the document. The numbers danced before her eyes, like a corporate death sentence. Her reflection in the window glass showed a woman who, for the first time, looked truly frightened. "This is impossible," her voice echoed through the empty room as she rose abruptly from her Italian leather chair. Documents flew from her desk, scattering across the floor like autumn leaves. Her assistant, who had stayed late waiting for news, instinctively retreated upon seeing the expression on her boss's face. In her mind, Valentina frantically reviewed the list of possible buyers: competitors, foreign investors, former partners thirsty for revenge. Each possibility seemed more terrifying than the last. Her empire was slipping through her fingers like fine sand, and she couldn't identify who was pulling the strings of this cruel spectacle. The phone on her desk rang incessantly. Frightened directors, nervous shareholders, journalists sniffing out the story. Valentina left the calls unanswered, for the first time in her life not knowing what orders to give, what threats to make, what strategies to use. The power she cherished so much was melting like ice in the sun. Her office, once a symbol of absolute power, now seemed suffocating. The expensive paintings on the walls, the imported furniture, the business awards on her shelves, everything seemed to mock her current powerlessness. For the first time in her life, she wasn't in control, and this realization hit her like successive waves of panic. An expensive whiskey bottle was opened, Valentina's hands trembling so much she almost spilled the amber liquid as she served herself. The ice clinked in her glass like funeral bells, announcing the end of an era. Each sip seemed more bitter than the previous one, unable to drown the growing terror in her chest. The worst of all was the uncertainty. Not knowing who was behind it all was like being hunted by an invisible predator. Each shadow seemed to hide a threat, each sound like a harbinger of destruction. Valentina, who always prided herself on knowing all the market players, now found herself cornered by a faceless enemy. The clock on the wall marked the hours mercilessly, each tick-tock reminding Valentina that her time was running out. The city lights shone through the windows of her corporate penthouse, indifferent to the drama unfolding inside. Somewhere out there, someone was laughing at her misfortune, savoring every moment of her fall. And so, alone in her office, increasingly resembling a golden prison, Valentina faced her worst nightmare: total loss of control. The empire she built with an iron fist was about to change hands, and she, the former queen of this corporate kingdom, had no idea who was about to take her place on the throne. The company's boardroom was packed for the extraordinary shareholders' meeting. Valentina occupied her usual position at the head of the table, but her habitual air of superiority was shaken. Executives and shareholders whispered among themselves, speculating about the identity of the mysterious buyer who had called that meeting. The tension in the room was palpable when the doors opened. Helena entered, elegantly dressed in an impeccable business suit, followed by her team of lawyers and the two former apprentices, now her trusted executives. The silence that followed was deafening. Some of the older attendees recognized her immediately, despite the scars on her face. Valentina, for a moment, couldn't associate that imposing figure with the seamstress she had humiliated years ago. Her eyes nervously scanned Helena's partially paralyzed face, trying to understand what was happening. "What does this mean? What is she doing here?" she asked aloud, her arrogance trying to mask her growing panic. Helena walked calmly to the center of the room, her heels echoing in the tense silence. With a precise gesture, her team began distributing folders with documents to everyone present. "As the majority shareholder," she announced, her voice clear and firm, "I called this meeting to discuss some necessary changes in the company's management. The numbers were irrefutable." Helena now controlled 51% of the company's shares. Each acquisition had been meticulously documented, each transaction perfectly legal. "As you can see," she continued, indicating the charts projected on the screen, "the current management has been leading the company to a steady decline in recent years." Valentina's face grew paler with each slide presented. Graphs showed drops in sales, increases in labor lawsuits, loss of market share. Helena exposed each failure with surgical precision, each number a stab in her former tormentor's ego. "The situation requires immediate and profound changes," she declared. The two former apprentices observed the scene with a mixture of admiration and satisfaction. They, more than anyone, knew the long road Helena had traveled to reach this moment. "The employees deserve management that values them," said one of them, presenting data on the precarious working conditions in the factories. The buzz in the room increased as the presentation progressed. Some shareholders nodded in approval, others whispered nervously. Valentina remained in her chair like a queen about to be dethroned, her expensive jewelry now resembling chains that bound her to her fate. Helena concluded her presentation with a clear proposal, a complete restructuring of the company, starting with the immediate replacement of the current president. "It's time to bring dignity back to this company," she declared, her eyes fixed on Valentina. "And for that, we need to remove what is poisoning it." The moment Helena had waited for years had finally arrived. There, before all those who had once bowed to Valentina's power, she was about to complete her revenge. But it wouldn't be a revenge driven only by hatred. It would be a complete transformation of everything Valentina represented. The boardroom had transformed into a silent battlefield. Valentina rose abruptly, her jewelry tinkling with the sudden movement. "This is ridiculous. You cannot be taking this. This..." She couldn't finish the sentence, her voice trembling with rage and disbelief. Helena walked slowly toward Valentina, each step calculated and precise. The sound of her heels echoed through the tense silence of the room. Stopping a few meters from her former tormentor, she smiled, a smile that even on just half of her face carried years of pain, transformed into triumph. "What's wrong, Valentina? Lost for words? You used to have so many to humiliate me." The shareholders and executives present watched the scene hypnotized. It was like watching a predator cornering its prey. Helena circled the conference table, her presence dominating the environment that once belonged to Valentina. "You know, I learned a lot from you at that charity event. I learned about power, about cruelty, about how people can be treated like insects." Valentina tried to regain her haughty posture, but her empire was crumbling before her eyes. "You can't do this. You have no right." Helena interrupted her with a cold laugh. "Right? You want to talk about rights? Like the labor rights you denied me? Like the right to proper medical treatment that you stole from me?" The two former apprentices approached, each positioning themselves beside Helena, forming a triangle that surrounded Valentina. "Remember them?" asked Helena, her voice loaded with irony. "The disposable employees you said could be easily replaced. Look at them now. Successful executives, a fundamental part of this company's future." With an elegant gesture, Helena picked up a glass of water from the table. The crystal sparkled under the room's lights, reminiscent of that fateful night. "You know what's ironic, Valentina? You were right about one thing. Some insects really do transform. Some become much more powerful than their predators." Valentina tried to walk toward the door, but her knees weakened. Her assistant rushed to support her, but Helena made a gesture, preventing the help. "No, let her fall. Sometimes we need to fall to understand how we treat others." Those present watched in absolute silence, witnesses to the end of an era. Helena moved even closer to Valentina, who was now precariously supported by the table. With a clear and strong voice, she pronounced the words she had kept for so long. "You are an insect, Valentina, a social insect that has fed on the dignity and work of others for years. But now it's you who will know the shadows." The transformation was complete. Power had changed hands, and everyone in the room could feel it. Helena was no longer the humiliated seamstress. She was a force of nature, bringing with her the storm that would sweep away all the past. "And unlike you," she concluded, "I know exactly what it's like to crawl before learning to fly." The reality of the situation finally hit Valentina with full force. Her eyes, once always loaded with contempt, now revealed pure terror as she watched Helena take her place at the head of the table. The scars on her former employee's face now seemed like medals from a war that she, Valentina, had started and lost spectacularly. Valentina's phone began ringing frantically, messages from her bank, notices from brokers, alerts from her lawyers. Her hands were trembling so much she could barely hold the device. "No, you can't," she stammered, as she watched her accounts being blocked and her access to the company's systems being revoked in real time. The two former apprentices began distributing new documents, detailed reports of all the irregularities committed during Valentina's management. Years of tax evasion, labor violations, fraud in bids, all meticulously documented. "How?" whispered Valentina, her face losing all color. "How did you get this information?" Helena smiled, that asymmetric smile that now sent chills down Valentina's spine. "You were so busy seeing me as an insect that you didn't notice I was observing your every move, every corrupt decision, every act of cruelty. I learned a lot from you, Valentina, especially what not to do." The security guards entered the room, no longer to protect Valentina, but to escort her out. Her expensive jewelry and designer clothes could no longer mask her absolute defeat. "Take your hands off me. Don't you know who I am?" she screamed, her shrill voice echoing through the corridors that were once her kingdom. The news spread quickly. Company employees crowded the hallways, watching their former boss being led out of the building. Some cried with joy, others openly applauded. Valentina stumbled between the guards, her mask of superiority finally shattered. Helena observed the scene from her new office, the one that had long been Valentina's throne. "The company now has a new direction," she announced over the sound system. "A direction based on respect, dignity, and human value." Her voice, firm and determined, echoed throughout the building. The sun was beginning to set when Valentina finally reached the parking lot. Her luxury car was no longer there. In its place, only an ordinary taxi waited. "Where should I take you, ma'am?" asked the driver. Valentina didn't answer. For the first time in her life, she didn't know where to go. From the window of her new office, Helena watched her former tormentor depart. The scars on her face gleamed in the day's last ray of sunlight, a permanent reminder of her journey. "Some insects transform into butterflies," she murmured. "Others remain crawling." The next day, newspaper headlines would announce the biggest corporate turnaround in recent years. Major media outlets competed for different angles of the story. Some focused on Helena's meteoric rise, others on Valentina's spectacular fall, but all agreed that a new era had begun in the business world. In her luxury apartment, which she would soon also lose, Valentina wandered through the rooms like a restless ghost. Her footsteps echoed through the empty spaces, although the environment was cluttered with expensive objects. On the coffee table, newspapers accumulated, each headline like a stab to her wounded pride. Textile empire changes hands. The fall of a queen. From factory floor to presidency. Each title struck her with renewed force. Her hands trembled as she touched the imported silks in her closet, the designer dresses that now seemed like costumes from a finished fairy tale. The Italian shoes, organized by color and occasion, seemed to laugh at her disgrace. In the closet that was once her pride, each piece now told a story of arrogance and cruelty. The phone rang incessantly, journalists eager for statements, former friends politely cutting ties, creditors beginning to smell her downfall. Valentina let the calls fall into the void, just as her empire had crumbled. On her dressing table, jewels sparkled under the dim light, diamonds, rubies, emeralds, each purchased with money she had squeezed from her employees over the years. On her living room wall, an immense painting portrayed Valentina in her days of glory, haughty, powerful, untouchable. Now, the woman in the bathroom mirror barely resembled that image. Her eyes, once sparkling with authority, were now opaque with defeat. The expensive lipstick on her lips could no longer disguise the trembling of her mouth. An expensive bottle of champagne, the last from her award-winning cellar, remained closed on the table. There was nothing to celebrate. Instead, Valentina served herself generous doses of whiskey, trying to drown not only the humiliation, but the growing understanding of her own role in her destruction. On the muted television, images of Helena followed one another in the news. Her scars, visible and proud, seemed like a silent accusation through the screen. Each of her smiles, even if partial due to paralysis, was a reminder of the strength Valentina never believed she possessed. The words echoed in her mind with painful clarity. "You are an insect." Her own voice, loaded with cruelty, came back to haunt her. The irony was suffocating. She, who had used that phrase to humiliate, now found herself crushed like an insect under the weight of her own evil. In her bedroom, one last attempt to keep up appearances, dozens of recent shopping bags, products of a desperate attempt to pretend nothing had changed. But the expensive labels could no longer mask the truth. She had been defeated, and not by just anyone, but by the woman she tried to destroy, the one who survived the fire not only of the flames, but of her cruelty. The night advanced, and Valentina remained seated in her Italian leather armchair, surrounded by all the luxury she would soon lose, confronting the only headline that really mattered, the one no newspaper needed to print because it was already engraved in her soul. She had been defeated by the woman she once called an insect and who had now learned to fly. The company's main auditorium was packed like never before. Helena had summoned not only the shareholders, but also representatives from all sectors of the company for this extraordinary assembly. The air was heavy with expectation as she climbed onto the stage, her scars visible under the intense lights. "Today is not just another corporate meeting," she began, her firm voice echoing through the environment. "Today is the day when the truth will be heard." Valentina was seated in the front row as Helena had demanded, her expensive jewelry shining in contrast to her somber expression. Next to her, a stack of documents detailed every irregularity of her management. "For years," Helena continued, "this company was managed through fear and oppression. Today, this ends." The presentation began with graphs and numbers that revealed the true state of the company under Valentina's management. Misappropriation of funds, tax evasion, labor violations, each slide was a new devastating revelation. "We are not just talking about mismanagement," Helena explained. "We are talking about a deliberate system of exploitation and abuse." The two former apprentices, now respected executives, presented detailed reports on the conditions in the factories. Photos, testimonials, records of concealed accidents, everything came to light. Valentina squirmed in her chair as her reputation was systematically destroyed before everyone. The legal department presented an endless list of labor lawsuits that had been hushed up over the years. "Each number on this list represents an affected life," Helena highlighted, "a person who had their dignity stolen in the name of profit." The tension in the auditorium increased with each new revelation. Longtime employees nodded in recognition, while new ones listened in horror to the accounts of the company's dark past. "This is not a trial," declared Helena. "It is a necessary cleansing." The independent audit team presented their final report, a devastating document that left no doubt about the need for change in management. Valentina tried to interrupt several times, but her voice was silenced by the avalanche of evidence against her. The auditorium's security cameras recorded every moment. Helena had ensured that everything was documented, that there would be no possibility of future contestation. "What we will see today," she announced, "will be just the beginning of a complete transformation." The minority shareholders, many of whom had been manipulated for years, were beginning to understand the extent of the damage caused by Valentina's management. The murmur of indignation grew in the auditorium as more details were revealed. One by one, employees began to stand up. The first was an elderly gentleman who had worked in maintenance for 2 decades. His calloused hands trembled as he held the microphone. "She treated us like broken machines. When I got sick because of the chemicals we were forced to use without protection, I was simply discarded." A young woman from the administrative sector was next. Tears ran down her face as she reported years of bullying. "She humiliated us daily. She even timed our bathroom breaks, called us incompetent, made a point of belittling us in front of everyone." Valentina fidgeted in her chair as the accusations piled up. A former production line supervisor revealed how she was forced to pressure the seamstresses. "We had to establish impossible goals. Those who didn't reach them were punished with unpaid overtime. If anyone complained, they were immediately fired." Her voice trembled as she remembered how many lives she had helped destroy under Valentina's orders. The stories followed one another, each more shocking than the last. A seamstress showed the marks on her hands. "We worked with defective machines. When someone got hurt, we were instructed not to record the accident. How many of us carry invisible scars?" A group of night shift employees reported how they were forced to work in unhealthy conditions. "In winter, we froze. In summer, we suffocated. The fans were turned off to save energy, even when the temperature was unbearable." Her words echoed through the auditorium, provoking murmurs of indignation. The most impactful testimony came from Valentina's former secretary. "I witnessed everything. The fraud, the fake documents, the threats. I lived in fear of speaking out for years, but today I can no longer remain silent." Her firm voice carried the weight of years of forced silence. The 2 young women whom Helena had saved from the fire also spoke, now as respected executives. "On that day of the fire, while Helena was risking her life for us, Valentina was more concerned about the material damage. People were never her priority." An accountant, visibly trembling, exposed the financial manipulations. "She forced me to falsify the numbers, to hide the irregularities. She threatened not only my employment, but my professional reputation." His eyes couldn't face Valentina while he spoke. Helena observed each testimony with respectful attention. Her face, marked by scars, reflected the pain of each shared story. Each person in this room, she declared, represents hundreds of others who have suffered in silence. The last to speak was a young lawyer from the legal department. We spent years burying lawsuits, buying witnesses, destroying evidence. Today I understand that we were accomplices in a perverse system. His words fell like the final shovel of dirt on Valentina's reputation. After hours of devastating testimonies, Helena returned to the stage for the final moment. The auditorium was in complete silence, the atmosphere heavy with the weight of all the revealed truths. Valentina, once so imposing, now seemed to wilt in her chair, her expensive jewelry looking like chains that bound her to her past of cruelty. The shareholders will now vote on the permanent removal of Valentina Loureiro from all positions and functions in this company, announced Helena, her voice echoing through the tense environment. Security guards positioned themselves strategically near the former businesswoman, anticipating her reaction. The voting process began, each shareholder expressing their decision. The count was quick and unanimous. Not even Valentina's former allies dared to position themselves in her favor after the day's revelations. By unanimous decision, declared Helena, Valentina Loureiro is officially removed from all her positions and permanently banned from any future participation in this company. Valentina finally exploded, rising abruptly from her chair. "You cannot do this. This company is my life. I built all of this." Her hysterical voice echoed through the auditorium as she tried to advance toward the stage. The security guards quickly restrained her, but she continued to shout, "You're nothing but an insignificant seamstress. How dare you destroy me like this?" Helena observed the scene with devastating calm. "The company you built is dead, Valentina. In its place will be born a company based on respect and dignity." With a gesture, she signaled for the guards to begin escorting Valentina out. Valentina's path to the exit was a spectacle of humiliation. Employees who for years had bowed their heads in her presence now faced her openly. Some cried, others applauded, but all were witnesses to the fall of their former tormentor. At the main entrance of the building, Valentina had to surrender her badge, her keys, and all corporate devices. Her hands trembled as she removed the symbols of her power for the last time. "This isn't over," she threatened, but her voice no longer carried the same authority as before. The security guards accompanied her to the sidewalk, where a common taxi awaited her, no longer her luxurious corporate limousine. Valentina looked one last time at the building that had for so long been her kingdom. The lights of the building shone against the night sky, indifferent to her personal tragedy. Inside the auditorium, Helena concluded the assembly. "Today marks not only the end of an era of oppression, but the beginning of a new journey." Her voice carried the promise of change, while outside Valentina Loureiro disappeared into the night, leaving behind the empire she built through cruelty and fear. The taxi departed slowly, its wheels creaking on the wet asphalt, taking with it the former dethroned queen. Valentina, now diminished in the back seat, looked one last time through the foggy window at the empire she had built and lost. Her hands, still adorned with rings that would soon have to be sold, trembled as she tried to dry tears that insisted on falling. In the windows of the building, dozens of hopeful faces gathered, some still incredulous at the transformation they were witnessing. Longtime employees, who for years had suffered under Valentina's regime of terror, exchanged glances of relief and restrained smiles. A cleaning lady who had worked there for 2 decades couldn't hold back her tears as she watched the departure of the woman who had humiliated her so much. The taxi driver, unaware of the historical importance of that moment, adjusted the rearview mirror and inadvertently captured the image of Valentina crumbling in the back seat. Her power, her posture, her aura of superiority, everything was falling apart like a house of cards in the wind. The expensive perfume she still wore now seemed like a bitter reminder of luxuries that would never return. On the sidewalk, the 2 former apprentices whom Helena had saved from the fire remained hand in hand, their faces reflecting a mixture of satisfaction and compassion. "Who would have thought," one of them whispered, "that we would see this day?" The other one just squeezed her hand more tightly, remembering all the times Valentina had treated them as disposable beings. The building security guards, The same ones who for years had bowed to Valentina's whims now maintained an upright posture, their faces showing recovered pride. One of them, the oldest, muttered to his colleague, 20 years opening the door for her, and today we closed it for the last time. The sky was beginning to darken, and the first stars appeared on the horizon. The building lights were turning on one by one, like candles of hope illuminating the beginning of a new era. The reign of terror had ended, taking with it not only Valentina Lorero's power, but an entire culture of fear and oppression that she represented. In the building lobby, employees hugged discreetly, some crying, others laughing nervously. A young woman from the finance department, who had been humiliated so many times in meetings, finally released the breath she seemed to have been holding for years. "It's over," she said, her voice breaking. "It's really over." The taxi diminished in the distance, becoming just a dot in the urban landscape. With it went the last representative of an era of cruelty and disregard. At the reception, an old employee silently removed the golden plaque with Valentina Lorero's name, symbolically marking the end of her reign. Helena, observing everything from her new office, gently touched her scars as she watched the taxi disappear in the distance. There was no vindictive satisfaction in her gaze, only the serenity of someone who knew that justice, although slow, had finally arrived. The last vestige of Valentina's power dissolved on the horizon, leaving behind not a vacuum, but a space ready to be filled with something much more valuable: humanity. Days later, the company auditorium was decorated in a simple but elegant way for the transformation ceremony. Helena, standing on stage, observed the hopeful faces of her employees. 5 years had passed since Valentina's fall, and the change she was about to announce represented the fulfillment of a dream. "Today," she began, "I am no longer your boss. Today, I officially become your partner." The documents transforming the company into a cooperative were projected on the screen. Each employee would receive a share of the profits, have voting power in important decisions, and actively participate in management. "What we've built here doesn't belong to a single person," Helena declared, her voice laden with emotion. "It belongs to everyone who dedicates their lives to making this company work." The two former apprentices, now directors, presented the new management model. Committees were formed with representatives from all sectors, ensuring that every voice would be heard. The old rigid hierarchical system gave way to a more horizontal and collaborative structure. "No one here will be treated as disposable," Helena assured. The finance department presented numbers proving the success of the pilot model implemented in recent months. Productivity had increased, the work environment had improved, and profits were distributed fairly. "When people truly feel part of something," Helena explained, "they give their best." The older employees could hardly believe the transformation. Many remembered the dark days under Valentina's command, when they were treated like worthless machines. Now, each received an official certificate as co-owner of the company, their names printed on fine paper, symbolizing their importance. In the new structure, the Human Resources Department was completely redesigned. Benefits were expanded, including on-site childcare, comprehensive medical assistance, and continuing education programs. "Investing in people is not an expense," Helena stated. "It's the greatest asset a company can have." The factories also underwent a radical transformation. Modern and safe equipment replaced the old worn-out machines. The work environment was redesigned to ensure comfort and safety, with adequate rest areas and efficient ventilation systems. The ceremony reached its peak when Helena called to the stage an elderly seamstress who had worked at the company for 30 years. Together, they symbolically signed the final document of the transformation. "From today onwards," Helena announced, "the success of this company will be the success of each one of you." The tears in the employees' eyes were no longer of fear or sadness, but of hope and gratitude. Helena looked at her own reflection in the glass of the podium. Her scars now were symbols not only of overcoming, but of transformation. The party that followed wasn't a display of luxury, as in Valentina's times, but a genuine celebration of unity and achievement. Helena circulated among the employees, not as a distant boss, but as an integral part of a new corporate family being born at that moment. The morning sun illuminated the modern facade of the new building. An elegant banner announced, "New Beginning Foundation, support for workplace accident victims. Helena stood before the entrance, her scars proudly visible as she prepared for the inauguration ceremony. Beside her, a line of people waited to get to know the space that would change their lives. "This place is born from pain, but rises with hope," declared Helena as she cut the inaugural ribbon. The building, equipped with the most modern rehabilitation facilities, represented a massive investment of her personal fortune. Each floor was designed with the specific needs of different types of workplace accidents in mind. At the rehabilitation center, patients were already receiving their first treatments. Specialized professionals, cutting-edge equipment, and a welcoming environment formed the heart of the foundation. "Here, no one will need to choose between adequate treatment and financial survival," Helena explained, remembering her own experience. The psychological support wing was filled with people sharing their stories. Support groups formed naturally, creating networks of solidarity among patients. "Trauma is not just physical," Helena emphasized during the presentation. "Emotional scars need as much care as the visible ones." The Foundation's legal department was already working on various cases. Specialized lawyers offered free support to workers who, like Helena once did, faced legal battles after accidents. "Knowledge is power," she affirmed, "and no one will have to face these struggles alone anymore." In the professional training area, courses and workshops were offered to help with reintegration into the job market. Helena made a point of personally participating in the inaugural classes, sharing her experience of overcoming adversity. "Every person here has the potential to reinvent themselves," she encouraged. The research and development sector focused on new rehabilitation technologies. Partnerships with universities and medical centers ensured that the foundation was always at the forefront of treatments. "Innovation and compassion can and should walk together," Helena declared to the researchers. Success stories were already beginning to emerge. A young female worker, victim of an accident similar to Helena's, proudly showed her progress in rehabilitation. "If it weren't for the foundation," she testified, "I would have given up. Here I found the strength to start over." The foundation's corridors echoed with voices of hope. People who previously felt alone in their pain now found support and understanding. Helena walked among them, not as a distant benefactor, but as someone who intimately knew each step of that journey. The inauguration day was coming to an end, but the work was just beginning. Helena observed the movement from her office at the foundation, her heart overflowing with fulfillment. "From the ashes of my own trauma," she reflected, "something was born that will transform other lives." The medical school auditorium was packed for the graduation ceremony. Helena sat in the front row, her heart overflowing with pride as she watched her son, now Dr. Miguel, receive his diploma. The young doctor had specialized in reconstructive surgery, inspired by his mother's story of overcoming. The scars on Helena's face shone with happiness as tears ran down the side of her face that could still express emotions. "And as the class speaker, we invite Dr. Miguel," announced the dean. The young doctor took the stage, his immaculate white coat contrasting with his brown skin, inherited from his mother. His speech began by recalling the story that inspired him to follow that path. "My mother taught me that scars are not just marks of pain, but also symbols of overcoming." The two former apprentices, now Miguel's godmothers, watched with emotion. They had accompanied every step of that journey, from Helena's first days in the hospital, pregnant and fighting for her life, to that moment of triumph. The young doctor had already secured his residency at the surgical center of the New Beginning Foundation, determined to continue the legacy of transformation initiated by his mother. Miguel descended from the stage after his speech and walked directly to Helena, embracing her tightly. "Every surgery I perform, Mom, will be a tribute to your strength," he whispered. The moment was captured by dozens of cameras, the young doctor hugging his mother, her scars visibly worn with pride, symbolizing a story of overcoming that now gained a new chapter. At the reception that followed, Helena observed her son animatedly conversing with other doctors about innovative reconstructive surgery techniques. He had already developed a project to bring specialized care to victims of work accidents in underprivileged regions, further expanding the reach of the work initiated by his mother. Miguel's professors made a point of congratulating Helena. "Your son has revolutionized our way of thinking about reconstructive surgery," one of them commented. He doesn't just see the physical scars, but understands the story behind each mark. Helena smiled, remembering how Miguel grew up hearing stories about overcoming and transformation. The young doctor already had his first surgery scheduled, a young seamstress who had suffered burns in an accident similar to his mother's. "I'll give her the chance you never had," Miguel promised Helena. "Each patient will receive the treatment you deserve to have received." The night progressed, and Helena couldn't contain her emotion as she watched her son receiving congratulations from colleagues. That baby she carried during the most difficult moments of her life had transformed into a man determined to heal not only bodies, but also souls marked by trauma. The scars on Helena's face seemed to smile along with her as she observed her son. The insect that Valentina had so despised had not only transformed into a butterfly, but now saw its wings multiplying through her son. Sometimes, Helena thought, from the greatest pains come the most beautiful purposes. The future opened like a blank page before mother and son. Helena observed Miguel in his new office at the foundation, his skilled hands examining X-rays and medical records of his first patients. Each of his gestures reminded her of her own journey, but now transformed into something even greater through her son's choices. "You know, Mom," said Miguel while organizing his notes on a particularly challenging case, "every time I enter surgery, I take with me all the stories you told me. Each patient who arrives here carries not only scars, but interrupted dreams just like you had." His eyes, so similar to his mother's, shone with determination as he explained his plans to revolutionize reconstructive surgery techniques. Helena had transformed her pain into a foundation that helped thousands of people, creating a support network that extended far beyond medical treatments. The waiting rooms were always full of stories of overcoming, former patients returning to show their progress, families expressing gratitude for the second chance, professionals dedicated to making a difference. Miguel walked through the corridors of the foundation with the same compassion as his mother, stopping to talk with each patient, listening to their stories, sharing words of encouragement. "Look, Mom," he would say, showing the results of his latest surgeries, "each procedure is an opportunity to rewrite a story, just as you rewrote yours." The two former apprentices, now integral to the Foundation's administration, frequently commented on how Miguel had inherited not only Helena's determination, but also her ability to see beyond the scars. "It's as if the circle is closing," they would say, observing mother and son working together to transform lives. The Foundation grew each day, expanding its services and reach. Helena had created scholarship programs to train new professionals specialized in trauma and rehabilitation, ensuring that the work would continue even beyond her generation. Miguel, in turn, developed new surgical techniques, combining the precision of modern medicine with the humanity he had learned from his mother. In the medical team meetings, it was common to see mother and son discussing cases, each bringing their unique perspective. Helena with her lived experience and deep understanding of emotional trauma, Miguel with his technical knowledge and innovative vision. Together, they created treatment protocols that considered not only physical recovery, but the complete reconstruction of patients' self-esteem and dignity. "Every patient I see," Miguel confided to his mother during a quiet moment between consultations, "makes me think about how you were in that hospital bed, pregnant with me, fighting not just for your life, but for our future. Each successful surgery is a way to thank you for everything you built." The story that began with a tragedy was now transforming into a symbol of hope for future generations. Helena's legacy wasn't just in the walls of the Foundation or in the lives she had helped rebuild, but in the heart of her son, who transformed the painful past into a future of healing and renewal. The scars on Helena's face, which once were used to humiliate her, were now her greatest strength, a living testimony that the deepest marks can become a source of inspiration and change. And through Miguel's skilled hands, this message would continue to echo, touching more and more lives, proving that true power lies not in hurting, but in healing. The lawyer's office was filled with papers scattered across the desk. Valentina, who was once the most powerful businesswoman in the textile industry, now wore clothes that, although still trying to appear elegant, showed clear signs of wear. Her jewelry had been replaced by costume pieces, and her nails, once always impeccable, were broken and poorly maintained. Mrs. Loureiro, the lawyer began, uncomfortably adjusting his glasses, the audit results are conclusive. Your attempts to recover your assets through high-risk investments have only worsened your situation. Valentina clutched her counterfeit designer handbag so tightly that her knuckles were white. The numbers were relentless. After losing the company, Valentina had tried to regain her status through risky stock market bets. Each investment more desperate than the previous, each decision more reckless than the last. "Is there nothing left?" she asked, her voice trembling for the first time in years. The lawyer slid another document across the table, an eviction order from her luxury penthouse. "The debts exceed any possibility of recovery," he explained. "Creditors are demanding even your personal belongings as a form of payment." Valentina watched her world crumble through the pages of lawsuits and collections. News of her bankruptcy spread quickly through the social circles she valued so much. Former friends no longer answered her calls. Invitations to events stopped arriving. Doors once open were now closed. "How dare they treat me like this?" she screamed into the phone, but her words no longer carried the same power. In her apartment, still luxurious but about to be lost, Valentina drank a glass of cheap wine while watching court officials inventory her belongings. Each catalogued item was a stab to her pride. Paintings, rugs, jewelry, everything would be auctioned to pay her debts. The final blow came when she discovered that even her account at the most exclusive club in the city had been cancelled for non-payment. Valentina, who once humiliated so many people for her social position, was now barred at the entrance by security guards who previously bowed at her passage. The days transformed into a nightmare of collections and humiliations. Her phone rang incessantly with creditors demanding payments. The few people who still maintained contact only did so to share gossip about her fall in social groups. In one last desperate attempt to keep up appearances, Valentina tried to open a small business with the little money she had hidden. But her arrogance and lack of ability to work without privileges led to yet another resounding failure. Reality finally hit her on a cold morning when she woke up in a small rented apartment on the outskirts of the city. Her designer clothes had been replaced by common pieces, her imported coffee by supermarket brands. The mirror reflected not just her physical decay, but the death of an entire empire built on cruelty and pride. The small advertisement in the newspaper seemed to mock Valentina. "Experienced seamstress needed." Her hands trembled as she held the paper. She, who once commanded a textile empire, now found herself forced to look for employment as a simple worker. The address indicated a modest factory on the outskirts of the city, so far from her former world of luxury and power. With her last savings, Valentina bought a used sewing machine and began to practice in her tiny apartment. Her delicate hands, once accustomed only to signing documents and raising champagne flutes, now were injured by needles and pins. "Damn you, Helena," she muttered, every time the thread broke or the stitch came out crooked. The job interview was a humiliating experience. Sitting in an uncomfortable chair in the reception of the small factory, Valentina observed other candidates arriving, simple women, with calloused hands and tired faces, the kind of person she used to ignore in her former life. The smell of cheap fabric and machine oil permeated the air. The factory supervisor, a robust woman with a severe expression, examined her improvised resume with suspicion. "Experience in textile management?" she asked ironically. "Here we need people who really know how to sew, not just those who know how to give orders." Valentina swallowed her pride and lied, claiming to have practical experience. The practical test was even worse. Her hands were shaking so much that she could barely thread the needle. The other candidates observed her with a mixture of curiosity and pity while she struggled with the industrial sewing machine. Sweat ran down her face, smudging what remained of her expensive makeup. By a miracle, or perhaps due to a lack of better options, Valentina was accepted for the job. The salary was a tiny fraction of what she used to spend on a single pair of shoes. "You start tomorrow," the supervisor informed her dryly. "We don't tolerate delays or excuses." Back in her apartment, Valentina stared at her reflection in the small bathroom mirror. Her fake jewelry could no longer disguise the reality of her situation. She would have to work like those she had so despised, submit to the same conditions she considered unworthy for human beings. The night was long and sleepless. Valentina tossed and turned in the narrow bed, remembering the times when she slept on Egyptian silk sheets. Now her alarm was set to ring long before dawn. She would need to take 2 buses to reach the factory. The simple uniform she received seemed to burn her skin accustomed to fine fabrics. It was faded blue without cut or style, exactly the same as her former employees wore. How is this possible? She thought, adjusting the plastic badge with her name. How did I end up here? On the eve of her first day, Valentina sat on the edge of her bed, looking at her hands already marked by the first calluses. Fate had prepared a cruel irony for her, working in the same conditions that she once considered too good for her employees. Tomorrow promised to be just the beginning of her true punishment. Valentina's first day at the factory began before the sun rose. Dressed in her faded blue uniform, she squeezed into the crowded bus, surrounded by other workers who, like her, were starting their journey. The smell of sweat and cheap coffee invaded her nostrils, while she tried to maintain what remained of her dignity. The supervisor was waiting for her with a cruel smile on her lips. "So you're the new seamstress?" she asked, measuring Valentina from head to toe with a critical eye. "Let's see if your delicate hands can keep up with the production pace." The other employees observed the scene with poorly disguised curiosity, some recognizing in that fragile woman the former businesswoman they so feared. Valentina was placed at the last machine in the row, the oldest and noisiest one. "This will be your workstation," announced the supervisor loudly, ensuring that everyone heard. "I hope you're not used to much comfort because this is no place for princesses." The contained laughter of the other seamstresses echoed through the warehouse. Throughout the day, the supervisor made a point of constantly stopping beside Valentina, timing her work and pointing out each error with cruel satisfaction. "What a disappointment," she declared loudly. "I thought someone who claimed to be so important would know how to do something so simple." Each word was a needle in Valentina's already wounded pride. During lunch, no one sat with her in the simple cafeteria. Valentina ate her poorly prepared packed lunch alone, observing groups of employees who whispered and pointed in her direction. Coffee was served in plastic mugs, a brutal contrast to the porcelain cups she used to use. The afternoon brought new challenges. The production goals seemed impossible to achieve, and her back ached from the effort of staying bent over the machine. The supervisor passed by again, tapping her stopwatch with exaggerated force. "Too slow, we don't pay you to daydream." When a thread broke for the 3rd time, the supervisor lost her patience. She gathered all the employees around Valentina's machine and began her humiliating speech. "Look at this, girls. Who would have thought that the great Valentina Loureiro can't even make a straight stitch? Perhaps we should treat her as she treated her employees." Tears began to run down Valentina's face, smudging her cheap makeup. The supervisor smiled, satisfied. "Well, well. It seems that someone is finally learning her place. You are exactly like the one you called an insect, except she managed to fly and you can only crawl." The end of the workday came as a mercy. Valentina gathered her things with trembling hands, while listening to the supervisor announce loudly, "Tomorrow I want to see better production, or we'll have to reassess your position here. After all, there's always someone in need of a job." As she walked to the bus stop, her aching feet dragging along the uneven asphalt, Valentina passed by an appliance store displaying several televisions in the window. All showed the same news channel, multiplying the image she so wanted to avoid. On screen, Helena appeared inaugurating another unit of her foundation, her face marked by scars, shining with accomplishment as she cut the inaugural ribbon. "And today we inaugurate our 10th unit," Helena's voice echoed through the store's speakers, attracting the attention of passers-by. "Each new unit represents more lives transformed, more people who will have the chance that I didn't." Valentina remained paralyzed, hypnotized by the scene unfolding before her. Dr. Miguel, Helena's son, appeared by her side, his features painfully reminding Valentina how much time had passed. A group of people formed on the sidewalk watching the report. "This woman is amazing," commented an elderly lady. "Look at what she built after everything she suffered." Another spectator added, "And to think she started as a seamstress." Valentina pulled up the collar of her uniform, trying to hide her face from the onlookers, fearing being recognized. Feeling her legs weaken, Valentina leaned against the store wall. The contrast between her current reality and the images on screen was devastating. While Helena appeared surrounded by reporters and admirers, she was there, alone, dirty and exhausted after a day of humiliations. The weight of her past seemed to crush her shoulders, already curved from working at the sewing machine. Finally, managing to gather strength, Valentina lowered her head and continued on her way. The stained uniform, the aching feet in cheap socks, the plastic badge hitting against her chest. Every detail of her new life was a cruel reminder of her past cruelty. Helena's words echoed in her mind. "You are an insect." Now she understood in the most painful way possible the true meaning of that phrase. The bus stop was crowded with workers returning home. No one recognized her, or if they did, they didn't care. She was just another tired worker, waiting for public transportation on an ordinary night. Valentina sat on the cold metal bench, feeling every muscle in her body protest. The weight she carried wasn't just physical. It was the burden of all the humiliations she once inflicted on others that now came back to haunt her, in an endless dance of karma and poetic justice. Did you like Helena and Valentina's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like and check out the next one that's waiting for you here on screen. I'll see you there.